Alrighty, objective 2, evaluating functions if given an equation. Evaluating each function if the directions say that, and if I was going to do number 1 and model how to do that, I would first or just say it out loud. G of t equals 3t cubed minus 4, and it's asking me to find g of 3. 3 things should jump out at you about functions: input, output, and the function itself. From the video that we just watched, I know that the input is within the function. I'm going to underline the function in blue. That piece is the function. The input goes inside of that function. So the input in this case is my t variable. And they're asking me to input, they're finding g of 3. So in this case, the input is 3. So I'm going to know eventually that 3 is going to go in place of t, wherever I see a variable of t. Now, if that means that that's the input t is, and the output is g of t, whatever that gives me after I put it in through the function. It's important to note that g of t can also be considered my y variable as well, because it makes sense. My input, as I input it into the function, it's going to give me my output. The input is the x value, or the variable. The y, or the output, is the y value. So if I was going to solve this, that is all just for your information. Please make note of all of that. But if I was going to solve number 1, the first step I would do is to show that I actually know what this is asking me to do. So instead of g sub t, I'm going to write g of 3 equals 3. And instead of t, because I should be thinking that I'm going to replace t with something, I'm going to get in the habit of putting parentheses. You need to put parentheses whenever you're going to change a variable into an input. And that's cubed minus 4. Parentheses are important because if you notice, g of 3, the 3 is not negative, but in number 2, the input we're going to use is negative. And at times it can get confusing when working with negative numbers. So I always want to keep them in parentheses. So that's my first step, just rewriting the notation and making note what I'm actually going to start replacing, and replacing it with parentheses. The second step is to actually replace the parentheses, or put inside the parentheses, my input. So g of 3 equals 3 times 3, right? My input is 3 cubed minus 4. So the only difference between first and second step is I actually identified my input inside the parentheses. I need to see this step by step. I need to see the parentheses, and I need to see step 2, what goes inside the parentheses. And then finally, step 3. Step 3 will look different for each one of these problems, just depending on what the equation is asking you to do. Here it's asking me to cube a number. Number 2, it's going to ask you to square a number. So it just depends on that. But number 3, you just solve the problem for the math. So g of 3 equals 3 cubed is 27. So I'll write that out again. 3 times 27 minus 4. And then finally, the fourth step would just be continuing to simplify. G sub 3 equals 3 times 27 is 81. 81 minus 4 is 77. So for this given function, 3t cubed minus 4, if I input 3, my output will be 77. So to finalize this, what I'm going to ask you to do for each one of these, this is function notation in step 4. You also need to write it in, so my step 5 I'll put up here, coordinate point notation. So you should identify that if I input a 3, I will output a 77 into that function. That's my x, that's my y. So the final answer is step 4 here, and step 5 here. Those two things I need to see. Now, number 4, I'm going to get you started, just because I want you to be very careful of how you work with negatives, because in Algebra 2 this year, it only gets more complicated from this. And I can't have you, or it'd be awful to continue to make simple math mistakes, mental errors with working with negatives before we get into bigger concepts. So, number 4, again, the first step would be to rewrite it as what am I actually trying to evaluate? And this time they're asking me to evaluate the input of -4 equals -2. Instead of the t in the function, I'm going to replace it with a parenthesis, -1. This is why the parentheses are so very important, because in step 2, g of -4 equals 2 parentheses. I'm going to put in blue what my input is, which is a -4, and then -1. At times, like I've seen students make some mistakes where they would put, I'll just write it up here just to show you, g of -4 equals 2 times -4 minus 1, and if they don't put that in, the -4 in parentheses, it just gets jumbled. And so here I've very much identified what I need to do. It's going to be 2 times the -4 and then -1. And if you notice that step 3 for this one is a lot easier. G of -4, again, it's just math you have to do. 2 times -4 is -8, -8 minus 1. So finally, G of -4 equals -9. That's step 4. And then step 5, you identified a coordinate point. So if I input a -4 into this function, I output a 9. Hopefully by now you're making the connection that if I were to graph -2t minus 1, on that graph, if I went over to -4, it would also hit at +9. That's what those coordinate points mean.